Her body was found that following day, September 12, 1988, in the railroad yard in Lawrence. She had been stabbed to death, and her leg was amputated post-mortem when a train ran over her.
People love a good puzzle. It's very satisfying to solve it. But what if there's a missing piece? It's disappointing. It's infuriating. That's how police and the victim's family feel about a cold case. However, with advancements in technology, a number of high-profile cases are being solved every year, just like the 3 cold cases listed in this video that were solved in 2022. Reginald Ward. On September 18, 1983, canoeists on the Suwannee River near the I-10 bridge discovered human remains partially floating to the surface of the river, about 20 to 25 feet from the water's edge. The hands and feet of the body were bound with a rope, while 2 sandbags were wrapped around the person's neck to weigh the body down. At the time of the person's discovery, the unidentified male was listed as a white male, 6'2", and weighed approximately 132 pounds, and he was wearing a pair of denim jeans. Later, it would be revealed that John Doe was a black male. It was estimated that the body had likely been in the river for roughly 3 weeks and had been experiencing skin slippage. The following day after the discovery, a dive team from the Suwannee and Lafayette County Sheriff's Office searched the river for clues and found a .22 caliber Winchester semi-automatic rifle that was identified as a stolen weapon. Another item, a hunting knife, was also located and had been previously reported missing. The weapons were traced back to a home in Dowling Park. One of the residents interviewed by deputies indicated that a black male and 2 white males that were rough-looking were wandering around near the property. They were seeking assistance with their car that had broken down on the side of I-10. The car owner was identified, however the owner could not be located and was never considered a suspect in this case. Meanwhile, during the autopsy of the unidentified individual, a total of 9 bullet wounds were located on the body. Each wound was consistent with that of a .22 caliber bullet. It was concluded by the medical examiner that the John Doe had been shot to death with the rifle found in the river, and was bound and thrown in the river afterward. The original report never indicated a potential suspect, and the case became inactive shortly after. 27 years later, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement received a tip from a prisoner named William Clayton Sapp, saying he had information about a homicide that occurred in 1983 near the Suwannee River. Sapp was serving time at the federal prison, and said his father, William Clyde Sapp Jr., was involved in the 1983 homicide. His father was already dead. Agent Robert Shotwell began looking into the claim and found several individuals who said they'd heard Sapp Jr. had killed someone in the early 1980s with a .22 rifle and thrown him in the river. There was only 1 homicide like that during that time, but the victim still remained unidentified. A partial print from the victim was sent to the FBI for analysis, and in June 2012 it came back with a name, Reginald Ward. But the case went dormant again. Then in June 2021, podcaster Jason Futch, creator of the Suwannee Valley Unsolved podcast, saw a listing on Project Cold Case's website about the 1983 case. He began looking into it, finding old newspaper clippings from the Suwannee Democrat, and reaching out to the Suwannee County Sheriff's Office for more information. He reached Sergeant Wayne Kelly. A supplemental report written by Kelly read, "I asked Futch to send me the newspaper clippings and advised him that I would request the old case files and begin looking into the case." Stimulating Kelly's interest, he began looking into the 1983 homicide. Attached to the original case file was a sticky note and a medical report. The report showed that the victim in this case, who was listed as a John Doe, was identified in 2012 through latent prints from 1983. The prints identified the John Doe victim as Reginald Ward of the Quincy, Florida area. Sergeant Kelly began re-investigating the case. He could not re-interview William Clayton Sapp, who died in 2020, but learned that the man had spoken of his father's involvement in the murder to other family members over the years. A report written by Sergeant Kelly goes on to say that the incident was kept like a deep, dark secret until recent years. Nearly 40 years later, the Suwannee County Sheriff's Office now considers the Ward murder case closed. Though William Clyde Sapp Jr. died in 1996, he is considered the main suspect in this case due to statements from family. Melissa Tremblay. Next up, we have the case of Melissa Tremblay, who went by the nickname Missy. She was living in Salem, New Hampshire, and on September 12, 1988, Tremblay was playing outside of the LaSalle Social Club while her mother and her mother's boyfriend were inside the club at the time. At around 9 p.m., Tremblay's mother realized her daughter was missing and began to search for her. The last people to see Tremblay were a pizza delivery person and a worker for the railroad. She would never be seen alive again. The Essex District Attorney's Office reports that Melissa Tremblay was stabbed to death in the Boston and Maine Railway Yard in Lawrence, Massachusetts. As she lay dead on the train tracks, a train ran over her body, severing her left leg. Tremblay was only in the 6th grade and was just 11 years old when she was tragically murdered. For over 3 decades, there was no conclusive evidence in the case. Fortunately, after decades of searching, a suspect was finally found. Marvin McClendon Jr., a 74-year-old who now lives in Alabama, was arrested in April of 2022, some 34 years after the crime. McClendon formerly worked for the Massachusetts Department of Corrections, though he has since retired. He was a corrections officer between 1970 to 2002, and also reportedly worked as a carpenter. McClendon lived in Chelmsford, but paid frequent visits to Lawrence in 1988, where Tremblay was murdered. He worked in Lawrence and was apparently doing a carpentry job there at the time. Officers say that after bringing in a cold case team in 2014, they were able to uncover fresh evidence that pointed to the suspect. The DNA evidence found in 2014 on Melissa led investigators to McClendon's family, and they obtained DNA samples from some, including Marvin. This is what the prosecutors had to say about McClendon.
Additionally, the investigators were able to determine at the time of Melissa Tremblay's death, the defendant had a van consistent with what witnesses had seen her speaking with. The cause of her death was an incised wound to her neck. With the help of a medical examiner from the FBI, the Commonwealth was able to determine that the person that stabbed and killed Melissa Tremblay was left-handed. In researching and interviewing the various McClendons related to Mr. McClendon, the defendant before you is the only McClendon who is left-handed. He lived in Chelmsford at the time. He had ties to Lawrence. He would hang out here. He would work here. And those are essentially the facts as they relate to Mr. McClendon.
Marvin was charged with first-degree murder and is being held on no bail. It is unclear whether the suspect and victim knew each other, and there is no information leading investigators to believe the suspect was involved in any other crimes. Joy Hibbs. On Friday, April 19, 1991, Joy Hibbs' 12-year-old son David was dismissed early from elementary school and arrived home around 1:05 p.m. to find the kitchen on fire. Because of the fire and smoke, he could not get past the kitchen and frantically ran to neighbors for help, knowing his mother was home. After the fire was extinguished, the body of Joy Hibbs was found dead on a bed in David's bedroom. Investigators initially believed Hibbs had been a victim of an accidental fire. However, the autopsy the next day revealed she had been repeatedly stabbed, had fractured ribs, and was likely asphyxiated. The autopsy also found there was no smoke in her lungs, which the pathologist said indicated she died prior to the fire. The fire marshal investigated and determined the fire was intentionally set with 4 separate points of origin, 2 in the kitchen, 1 in David's bedroom, and 1 in the hallway. Investigators learned that Hibbs had cashed her paycheck hours before her death. Her wallet was found stuffed in the living room couch, and her purse was found with its contents emptied and strewn about in the kitchen. The initial investigation by the Bristol Township Police Department determined that Hibbs was likely murdered between 11:50 a.m. and 12:50 p.m. During that 1-hour timeline, witnesses reported seeing a blue Chevy Monte Carlo parked haphazardly outside the Hibbs home. At the time, investigators developed several suspects, including Robert Atkins, who was known to have a blue Chevy Monte Carlo and used to live 2 doors away from Hibbs. He was also known to occasionally sell marijuana to Joy Hibbs and her husband. Over the next 3 decades, Atkins remained a person of interest in the murder. He was interviewed by police at least twice, but always denied any involvement in her murder. The case was submitted to the Bucks County Investigating Grand Jury as soon as one was impaneled in January 2022. Among those to testify was April Atkins, Robert's ex-wife. She told the grand jury that in the early afternoon of April 19, 1991, Robert Atkins came home covered in blood. He told her that he had stabbed someone and lit their house on fire. He then told her to call out of work and gather the kids because they were taking a trip to the Poconos. She said he put his bloody clothes in the wash and showered. Records show they arrived at the Poconos just before 5 p.m. They stayed for 2 days, returning on Sunday, April 21, 1991. It wasn't until then that April Atkins said she found out it was Joy Hibbs who had been killed. Fearing her husband, she previously denied knowing anything about the murder. Robert Francis Atkins of Falls Township was charged on counts of murder in the first degree, murder in the second degree, 2 counts of robbery, and 7 counts of arson. Do you know of any other famous cold cases that were solved in 2022? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like it and also subscribe to our channel for your regular dose of whodunits. See you in the next one. Until then, stay safe, stay warm, and don't get any crazy ideas.